A single piece of coated paper is enough to start a war. Hunted across the frozen plains, a telegraph girl seeks refuge in the last place anyone would look. But secrets don't stay buried, and when the truth surfaces, it won't just threaten her life. It will put an entire family in the crosshairs. The truth has power, but it always comes with a price. This channel tells gripping Wild West stories about cowboys, love, motherhood, and the quiet humanity hidden in harsh lands. If this story keeps you curious, comment, share, and subscribe for more. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The Montana wind did not howl, it screamed. It tore across the jagged plains like a physical thing, driving ice crystals into Clara Vance's cheeks until her skin went numb. Every step required a negotiation with her own failing muscles. The snow was knee-deep and rising. And inside her left boot, the warm, sticky seep of blood from a blown blister had long since turned into a block of ice. She couldn't stop. If she stopped, the cold would take her, and if the cold didn't, Harlan Thorne's men would. Clara clutched her wool coat tighter against her throat, the worn fabric offering no real defense against the sub-zero drop. Beneath the coat, pressed flat against her ribs, was her satchel. Inside that satchel was a spool of punched telegraph tape, a string of dots and dashes that proved Thorne was starving out local ranchers to steal their land for the new rail line. It was a piece of paper worth a fortune, and currently it was getting her killed. Through the blinding whiteout, a shadow loomed. Not a tree. Straight, unyielding lines, wrought iron. Clara stumbled forward, her frost-rimmed eyelashes fluttering as she gripped the frozen metal of a massive gate. An archway curved overhead, the letters barely visible beneath the snow. Hayes Ranch. She had heard of it at the station. Wyatt Hayes owned half the valley and owed no man a dime. It was a fortress. It was also a mile from the main road. Clara took one step past the gate, her vision tunneling into a pinpoint of gray. Her frozen boot caught on a hidden rock. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the last breath from her lungs. She tried to push up, her fingers sliding numbly against the ice, but the scream of the wind faded into a heavy, seductive silence. Just for a minute, she thought, her cheek resting against the snow. Just a minute to rest. Get up. The voice cut through the haze, deeper than the wind, rough as river gravel. Clara forced her eyes open. A pair of scuffed, heavy leather boots planted themselves in the snow inches from her face. She followed the line of dark denim up to a heavy canvas duster, and finally to a face shadowed by the brim of a Stetson. Wyatt Hayes didn't look like a savior. He looked like the land itself, hard, weathered, and entirely unforgiving. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed her without a drop of pity. You freeze to death on my property. The sheriff's going to ask me questions I don't have the time to answer, he said flatly. Get up. Clara's teeth chattered so violently she bit her own tongue, tasting copper. Can't. Wyatt sighed, a short puff of white breath in the freezing air. He didn't offer words of comfort. He reached down with large, leather-gloved hands, gripped her under the arms, and hauled her to her feet. When her legs buckled, he simply swore under his breath, scooped her over his broad shoulder like a sack of winter feed, and marched toward the looming silhouette of the main house. Heat was the first thing Clara registered. Intense, painful heat. She gasped, sitting up. She was in a leather armchair in a sprawling, dimly lit study. A massive stone fireplace roared to her left. Her ruined boots and wet coat had been removed, leaving her in her damp wool skirt and blouse. Her satchel rested on a heavy oak desk nearby. Drink! A tin cup was shoved into her trembling hands. Clara looked up. Wyatt Hayes stood over her, having discarded his duster. He wore a simple flannel shirt that stretched across broad shoulders. There was a dangerous stillness to the man, a coiled tension that made Clara instantly hyper-aware of her surroundings. She took a sip, It was coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint, laced with a heavy pour of whiskey. It burned a path down her throat, settling in her stomach like a coal. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice scratching like a rusty telegraph key. "Don't thank me yet," Wyatt said, leaning back against his desk and crossing his arms. He studied her, his gaze clinical. "You're Clara Vance, the telegraph operator from town. Heard you vanished 3 days ago. Word is you stole something from the railroad." Clara's spine stiffened. She forced her shaking hands to lower the cup to her lap. "The word is a lie. I didn't steal anything. I intercepted a message that wasn't meant for my eyes." "I don't care," Wyatt interrupted, his voice devoid of curiosity. "Thorne's business is his own. Mine is this ranch. You brought Thorne's trouble to my front gate." "I'll leave," Clara said immediately, though the thought of walking back into that whiteout made her stomach turn. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, forcing her back into the armchair. I need work. Any work. Any wumulsh. Mending, cooking, cleaning, just enough to earn stagecoach fare out of the territory." Wyatt watched her struggle. He didn't step forward to help. "My housekeeper quit 3 weeks ago. Said my boys are feral and my house is a graveyard. She wasn't wrong." He turned, picking up a silver pocket watch from the desk, thumbing the lid open, then snapping it shut. "But I don't need a maid, Miss Vance, and you need a hell of a lot more than stagecoach fare. You need a fortress. Thorne's men are turning town inside out looking for you." Clara swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I have a proposition." Wyatt pushed off the desk, pacing slowly toward the fire. "I have 2 sons who are running wild. I have bankers in Helena who are threatening to call in my loans because they think a widower with a crumbling household isn't a stable investment. I need order. I need a respectable front." He stopped, turning his piercing gaze back to her. "I need a wife, on paper." Clara stared at him, sure the fever had set in. "Excuse me?" "A 1-year contract," Wyatt stated, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the price of cattle. "You manage the house, you manage the boys. We put on a united front for the town and the banks. In return, you get the protection of the Hayes name. Thorne won't touch my wife. He knows I'd bring down the federal marshals on his head. You get a roof, food, and at the end of the year, I'll hand you $500 and a train ticket to anywhere you want." "A marriage of convenience," Clara breathed. "To a total stranger." "It's a business partnership. Nothing more." Wyatt walked to a small wooden lockbox on the mantel. He opened it and pulled out a plain gold band. He walked back to Clara and held it out. "This was Martha's, my late wife. Put it on, and tomorrow the circuit judge will make it legal. You'll be safe." Clara looked at the ring sitting in his calloused palm. It was delicate, polished, and carried the ghost of a woman who had likely died of the very isolation Clara was about to step into. She looked at the ring, and then she looked up into Wyatt's eyes. She was desperate. She was freezing, but she wasn't a replacement. Clara reached out, but not for the ring. She pushed Wyatt's hand gently, firmly, back toward his chest. "I'll take the job, Mr. Hayes. I'll run your house, and I'll wrangle your boys," Clara said, her voice steadying, the steel of Chicago returning to her spine. "I'm signing on as a partner, but I won't play the ghost of your past." She met his stunned gaze without blinking. "Keep the ring. When the judge gets here, I'll provide my own." For a long, heavy moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Slowly, the corner of Wyatt Hayes' mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the first crack in the ice. He closed his fist around the gold band and slipped it into his pocket. "Tomorrow morning, then, partner." The circuit judge smelled of stale chewing tobacco and wet wool. He rushed through the vows as if the freezing parlor of the Hayes Ranch was actively offended by his presence. Perhaps it was. The house felt cavernous and hollow, a structure built for a family, but currently occupied only by ghosts and silence. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife, Judge Caldwell mumbled, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He didn't offer a smile, nor did he suggest the groom kiss the bride. He simply shoved the ledger across the heavy oak table. Sign here, both of you. Wyatt signed his name with sharp, aggressive strokes. The scratch of the nib echoed loudly. When he handed the pen to Clara, his fingers brushed hers. His skin was rough, calloused from years of gripping reins and driving fence posts, radiating a furnace-like heat that contrasted sharply with the ice in his eyes. Clara took the pen. She didn't hesitate. Clara Hayes. The name felt like a heavy woolen blanket, suffocating, but necessary to survive the winter. When it came time for the ring, Wyatt stood completely still. Clara reached into the pocket of her faded skirt and pulled out a simple, tarnished steel band she had purchased from the town blacksmith that morning for 75 cents. She slid it onto her own left ring finger. It was cold, heavy, and completely devoid of romance. It was perfect. Wyatt watched the steel ring settle against her pale skin. His jaw ticked, but he said nothing. He paid the judge, saw the man out the heavy oak front door, and threw the deadbolt with a resounding clack. They were alone. "I'll show you the house," Wyatt said, his voice dropping the polite cadence he'd used for the judge. He turned on his heel, expecting her to follow. Clara grabbed her battered carpet bag and trailed behind him. The Hayes house was a monument to wealth and neglect. The floors were polished mahogany, but dust lay thick on the baseboards. The furniture was expensive imported leather and carved oak, yet the rooms felt entirely unlived in, as if the occupants were merely passing through. "Kitchen is through there. The pantry is stocked. The hands eat in the bunkhouse, but Mrs. Gable used to cook for me and the boys here," Wyatt explained, gesturing to a swinging door. He didn't slow his stride as he moved to the grand staircase. "The boys are out with the foreman. They'll be back at sundown. You'll meet them then." He led her to the second floor, down a long hallway lined with closed doors, stopping at the double doors at the very end. Wyatt reached out, turned the brass knob, and pushed them open. The scent hit Clara immediately. Dried lavender and stale trapped air. It was a beautiful room, easily the size of the telegraph office where she used to work. A massive four-poster bed dominated the center, covered in a pristine embroidered quilt. But it was the details that made Clara's chest tighten. A silver hairbrush set perfectly aligned on the vanity. A wardrobe left slightly ajar, revealing the rich silks and heavy velvets of women's dresses. A pair of delicate riding boots standing at attention by the hearth. It was a museum exhibit of a dead woman. "This is the master suite," Wyatt said. He didn't cross the threshold. He stood in the doorway, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall to avoid looking at the bed. "The wardrobe is full. Martha was about your height. You can use whatever you need. The staff will expect you to take this room. It maintains the appearance." Clara stood in the hallway, gripping the leather handle of her bag until her knuckles turned white. She looked at the silk dresses, at the silver brush, and finally at the tight, agonizing tension corded in Wyatt's neck. He was a man holding his breath, waiting for a stranger to violate a sanctuary he couldn't bear to dismantle himself. "No," Clara said flatly. Wyatt finally looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me?" "I said no, Mr. Hayes." Clara took a step back from the open door. "I signed a contract to manage your household and your sons. I did not sign a contract to wear a dead woman's clothes or sleep in her bed. I told you I wouldn't play the ghost." "The ranch hands talk," Wyatt warned, his tone darkening. "If my new wife refuses the master suite, Thorne will hear about the fracture in the facade by the end of the week." "Then let them talk about how eccentric I am," Clara countered, her chin lifting. "I have my own clothes. I require a bed, a wash basin, and a door that locks. Where do those stairs lead?" She pointed to a narrow, uncarpeted staircase at the opposite end of the hall. "The attic," Wyatt said, staring at her as if she had grown a second head. "It's drafts, dust, and raw timber. There's a cast-iron stove, but it hasn't been lit in years. You can't sleep up there." "Watch me," Clara said. She walked past him, her boots thudding against the floorboards, and began the steep climb. Wyatt followed, his heavy footsteps trailing her. Clara pushed open the attic door. The air was frigid, smelling of dry pine and old soot. It was a cavernous space beneath the sloped roof, sparsely furnished with a narrow iron cot, a battered dresser, and a washstand. But what caught Clara's immediate attention was the circular gable window at the far end. She dropped her bag, walked straight past the cot, and stood before the glass. She wiped away a layer of grime with her sleeve. From this vantage point, she had an unobstructed panoramic view of the main gate, the valley road, and the tree line beyond. She could see anyone approaching from 3 miles out. "Perfect," she murmured. Wyatt stepped into the room, his towering frame making the slanted ceiling feel suddenly oppressive. He looked at the dust, the miserable iron cot, and then he looked at Clara. He noticed where she was standing. He followed her line of sight out the window, taking in the tactical sweep of the valley road. Understanding dawned in his ice-blue eyes. The irritation faded, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. "You aren't looking at a bedroom, Mrs. Hayes," Wyatt said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the empty space. "You're checking sight lines. You're treating my ranch like a garrison." Clara didn't flinch. She turned to face him, the pale winter light framing her silhouette. "Until Harlan Thorne is in a federal penitentiary or a pine box, everywhere is a garrison, Mr. Hayes. I prefer to see the wolves before they reach the door." Wyatt studied her for a long, silent moment. He looked at her threadbare coat, her stubborn jaw, and the cheap steel ring catching the dim light. He had expected a weeping victim or a gold digger to arrive at his gates. He hadn't expected a soldier. "I'll have one of the hands bring up a load of firewood and some fresh linens," Wyatt said. He turned toward the stairs. "Dinner is at 6. Don't be late. The boys need to understand the new chain of command." "Mr. Hayes?" Clara called out just as he reached the threshold. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Lock her door," Clara said softly. "Martha's room. Lock it and keep the key. You don't have to pretend with me." Wyatt didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, a sharp dip of his Stetson, and disappeared down the stairs. A moment later, Clara heard the heavy double doors of the master suite shut, followed by the definitive click of a brass lock turning. Clara exhaled a shaky breath, the white plume dissolving in the freezing attic air. She walked over to the cot, sat down, and began to tap her fingers against her thigh in quick, erratic bursts. Dot, dot, dash, dash, dot, Morse code. A nervous habit. She had a roof. She had a name. Now the real war began. Morning in the Montana Territory didn't arrive with gentle sunlight. It broke like a hammer against the frozen earth. Clara woke shivering, the embers in the cast-iron stove having died hours ago. She dressed quickly in the biting cold, layering a thick woolen sweater over her plain cotton dress. Her muscles ached from the tension of the previous few days, but the gnawing hunger in her stomach drove her down the narrow stairs. She found the kitchen at the back of the house. It was vast, dominated by a massive black iron cook stove and a long, scrubbed pine table. Standing at the counter, attempting to hack a slice off a hardened slab of bacon, was a boy who looked to be about 9 years old. He had Wyatt's dark hair, but his eyes were a stormy, hostile gray. Huddled beneath the heavy oak dining table, half hidden by the shadows, was a smaller boy, perhaps 4. He was clutching a carved wooden horse to his chest, his wide eyes tracking Clara's every movement like a hunted animal. "You must be Leo," Clara said, her voice calm and even. She walked toward the stove, grabbing a clean apron off a hook. "And Sammy." Leo slammed the butcher knife down on the cutting board. He turned fully to face her, crossing his arms. "You aren't our mother. I don't care what paper my father signed. You're just a stray he bought because he was tired of hearing the bankers complain." Clara didn't blink. She didn't gasp. and she certainly didn't offer a sweet, condescending smile. She calmly took the knife from the board, wiped the blade, and began slicing the bacon with practiced, even strokes. "You're absolutely right, Leo. I'm not your mother," Clara said, tossing the meat into a heavy cast-iron skillet. It immediately began to sizzle and spit. "And I have no intention of trying to replace her. But I am the woman managing this house, which means I make the meals, I set the rules, and I decide who eats." She cracked 3 eggs into the grease. "Now you can either sit at the table and eat a hot breakfast like a civilized young man, or you can stay hungry and angry. The choice is entirely yours." Leo's jaw worked furiously. He glared at her back, waiting for her to yell or snap. When she simply continued cooking, ignoring his defiance, he let out an exaggerated huff, pulled out a wooden chair, and dropped into it. Clara plated the food. She set a plate in front of Leo, then took a second plate and slid it gently across the floor, under the table, stopping a few inches from Sammy's boots. The small boy didn't move. He hadn't spoken a word since Clara arrived, and according to Wyatt, he hadn't spoken since his mother died. "Eat when you're ready, Sammy," she said softly, taking her own plate and sitting at the opposite end of the table. Suddenly, a hard biscuit bounced off Clara's shoulder, leaving a dusting of flour on her dark sweater. It clattered to the floor. Clara slowly lowered her fork. She looked at Leo. The boy's hand was still hovering over the biscuit basket, a sneer twisting his young features. He was pushing, testing the perimeter of the fence to see if it was electrified. Clara stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She walked over to Leo's chair, pulled it out from the table with him still in it, and looked down at him. "Stalls 1 through 4 in the main barn," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with the authority of a woman who had handled drunken railroad workers twice his size. "Muck them out. Fresh hay. When the foreman tells me you're done, you get your breakfast. Now march." Leo's eyes widened. "My father won't let you. Your father put me in charge of the house. If you want to go find him out on the range and complain that the new wife made you clean up horse manure because you threw food, be my guest. But you'll be walking, and it's 10 degrees outside." For a second, Clara thought the boy might throw a punch. Instead, his face flushed a furious red. He leaped out of the chair, grabbed his coat off a peg, and slammed the kitchen door so hard the window panes rattled in their frames. From the doorway, a slow, rhythmic clapping echoed. Clara spun around. Wyatt was leaning against the doorframe, a mug of coffee in his hand, dust dusting his duster. He had been watching the entire exchange. "Most women would have tried to hug him, or cried," Wyatt observed, his tone unreadable. "If I wanted to hug a porcupine, I'd go out into the woods," Clara replied, picking the thrown biscuit off the floor and tossing it into the slop bucket. "He's angry. Hugging him validates nothing but his pity. Hard work clears the mind." Wyatt took a sip of his coffee. The corner of his mouth twitched again. "Stalls 1 through 4 are the draft horses. They make a hell of a mess." "Good. He has a lot of anger to shovel." Wyatt's gaze drifted to the space under the table where Sammy was quietly eating the bacon with his fingers, watching them both. Wyatt's eyes softened with a grief so profound it made Clara ache, but he masked it quickly, turning back to her. "I need you to take the wagon into town today. Hank will drive you," Wyatt said, reaching into his pocket and tossing a small leather coin purse onto the table. It landed with a heavy jingle. "Buy whatever provisions you need for the house, and buy yourself some decent wool blankets. It's too damn cold in that attic." Clara stared at the purse. It was the first time in weeks she had access to actual money. "Are you sure it's safe? For me to go into town?" "You're Mrs. Wyatt Hayes now. Everyone in town knows it by now," Wyatt said, his voice hardening into steel. "Nobody touches what belongs to the Hayes Ranch. Go buy your blankets, Clara." 3 hours later, Clara found herself standing in the warm peppermint and kerosene-scented air of Miller's General Store. Hank, a massive, bearded ranch hand, stood by the door, acting as a silent, intimidating shadow. Clara moved methodically through the aisles, ordering flour, sugar, coffee, and 2 thick Hudson Bay wool blankets. For the first time in a month, she felt a tentative sense of peace. The ranch was hard, the boys were difficult, and Wyatt was an enigma, but it was real. It was a life she could build something from. She carried a bolt of heavy denim to the front counter to pay. As the clerk tallied the cost, Clara glanced out the frosted front window of the store. Her breath hitched in her throat. Standing across the muddy, snow-packed street, leaning against the wooden railing of the saloon, were two men. They wore long, dark dusters, not the canvas coats of cowboys, but the tailored wool of city enforcers. One of them was striking a match against the railing to light a cigar. As the flame flared, Clara recognized the jagged scar running along his jawline. It was Pike, Harlan Thorne's chief enforcer, the man who had chased her out of the Chicago telegraph office with a drawn revolver. Pike wasn't looking at the general store. He was talking to the town sheriff, slipping a thick wad of greenbacks into the lawman's breast pocket. The sheriff nodded, patting the pocket, and pointed directly down the valley road, toward the Hayes Ranch. Clara's blood ran colder than the Montana wind. Wyatt thought his name was a shield. He thought wealth and land meant safety. But Harlan Thorne didn't care about local ranchers. Thorne had the backing of the United States Railroad, and he had limitless capital to buy the law. "Ma'am, that'll be $14.20, the clerk said, pulling Clara from her spiraling panic. Clara shoved the money onto the counter, grabbing the heavy packages. She looked back out the window. Pike was looking across the street now. His eyes scanned the storefronts, tracking the movements of the townspeople like a predator in tall grass. Clara ducked her head, pulling her scarf tight over her hair. The Hayes Ranch wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a trap, and she had just locked Wyatt and his sons inside it with her. The wagon ride back to the Hayes Ranch was a study in controlled panic. Clara sat rigid on the wooden bench beside Hank, the heavy wool blankets she had purchased draped over her lap, offering no warmth against the ice in her veins. She kept her eyes fixed on the rutted, snow-packed road trailing behind them, waiting to see the dark silhouettes of Pike and his men cresting the ridge. They didn't come, not today. But Harlan Thorne's men were in the valley, and they had bought the town's law. The ticking clock in Clara's head, a constant rhythm of Morse code, grew deafening. The next morning, the Montana winter decided to remind them all who truly ruled the territory. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero before dawn. The air was so brutally cold it hurt to breathe, freezing the moisture in Clara's nostrils the second she stepped out of the kitchen door to fetch firewood. She paused on the back porch, her arms wrapped around 3 heavy splits of pine. The ranch yard, usually bustling with the quiet efficiency of cowboys tending to morning chores, was in a state of chaotic uproar. Men were shouting. Horses were whinnying in distress from the lower paddocks. Clara dropped the wood onto the porch and pulled her scarf tightly over her nose, hurrying toward the epicenter of the commotion, a low, thick-timbered outbuilding sitting near the main water troughs. The pump house. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning coal, sulfur, and panic. Wyatt was stripped down to his suspenders and a sweat-stained undershirt, his face streaked with black soot. Hank and 2 other ranch hands were crowded around a massive iron steam boiler that powered the subterranean water pump. It was a beast of modern industry dragged out into the Wild West, a complex network of brass gauges, iron pipes, and pressure valves. Right now, it was dead silent, save for a terrifying, high-pitched hiss escaping from a swollen joint. "The pressure's building in the firebox, but the governor won't release the steam to the pistons," Wyatt shouted over the hiss, straining with a massive iron wrench against a rusted valve wheel. His biceps bunched, tendons standing out in his neck, but the wheel refused to turn. "If we dump the fire now, the pipes will freeze solid in an hour. We lose the pump, we lose the herd." "Boss, it's seized tight," Hank yelled back, backing away as a jet of scalding steam shot from a loose fitting. "She's gonna blow if we don't vent the pressure. I am not losing 1,000 head of cattle to a frozen trough. Put your back into it." Clara stood in the doorway, analyzing the iron beast. It wasn't entirely unlike the massive pneumatic and steam-driven generator systems that powered the Central Telegraph Hub back in Chicago. She knew the language of pressure, heat, and release. She saw the problem immediately. They were trying to force the main release wheel, but the secondary bypass valve, a smaller brass fitting near the base of the governor, was locked shut by a buildup of hard water calcium and sheer cold. Clara stripped off her heavy wool coat, letting it drop to the dirt floor. She marched into the stifling, dangerous heat of the pump house. "Move," she said. Wyatt blinked through the sweat and soot, utterly baffled by the sight of his new wife stepping into the blast zone. "Clara, get the hell out of here. The boiler jacket is fracturing." "Hand me that spanner, Hank," Clara ordered, ignoring Wyatt completely. Her voice held the sharp, undeniable snap of a telegraph line manager. She didn't wait for the cowboy to comply. She snatched the heavy iron wrench from his hands. She dropped to her knees in the dirt and grease sliding under the scalding belly of the boiler. The heat was immense, singeing the stray hairs that had escaped her bun. "Clara!" Wyatt roared, dropping his own wrench and lunging to pull her out. "Don't touch me! Keep the main wheel steady!" Clara yelled back. She wedged the spanner onto the brass bypass nut. It was fused solid. She didn't have Wyatt's brute strength, but mechanics wasn't about strength. It was about leverage. She shifted her hips, bracing her heavy leather boots against the iron base of the boiler. She gripped the spanner with both hands, took a deep breath of the sulfur-choked air, and threw her entire body weight backward, using her legs to push. Crack! The calcium seal broke. Clara scrambled backward just as a violent, deafening roar of white steam erupted from the bypass valve, shooting directly into the dirt where her face had been a second before. The pressure gauge on the main tank plummeted into the safe zone. The massive iron pistons groaned, shuddered, and suddenly slammed forward. The rhythmic, thunderous thump hiss of the water pump echoed through the building. Outside, the cowboys cheered as fresh, unfrozen water began gushing into the cattle troughs. Clara sat in the dirt, her chest heaving, wiping a smear of black grease from her forehead with the back of her trembling hand. Her cotton dress was ruined, soaked in sweat and filthy with boiler grime. The pump house cleared out as the hands rushed to manage the thirsty herd, leaving only Wyatt and Clara. Wyatt stood over her. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling against his damp undershirt. He looked at the roaring steam engine, then down at the small, grease-stained woman sitting in the dirt. The ice in his eyes had completely melted, replaced by a burning, intense shock. He didn't offer his hand. He knelt down slowly, matching her level in the dirt. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smudge of soot from her cheekbone. The touch was scorching, far hotter than the boiler. "Where in God's name," Wyatt murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "does a city girl learn to bleed a high-pressure steam governor?" Clara held his gaze, her heart hammering a frantic Morse code against her ribs. "A city girl learns whatever she has to learn to keep things from exploding, Mr. Hayes." Wyatt's eyes dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes. The tension in the small, stifling room shifted from the mechanical danger of the boiler to something entirely different, something heavy and electric. "Wyatt," he said softly. Clara blinked. "What?" "My name is Wyatt. If you're going to save my ranch, you can stop calling me Mr. Hayes." He finally offered his hand. Clara placed her small, grease-stained hand into his massive one. He pulled her to her feet, his grip lingering just a second longer than necessary. That night, the attic was brutally cold, but Clara felt a strange, lingering warmth. She was sitting on the edge of her iron cot, staring out the gable window at the moonlit valley, when she heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps on the narrow stairs. Wyatt pushed the door open. He was clean, dressed in a fresh flannel shirt, holding a steaming mug in his hand. He walked over and handed it to her. It was coffee, laced with a generous pour of warm milk and sugar. "You didn't eat much at dinner," Wyatt noted, leaning his shoulder against the raw timber frame of the attic roof. "I was tired," Clara admitted, wrapping her hands around the ceramic mug to absorb the heat. "You've won Leo over, slightly," Wyatt said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He asked Hank if you were a witch. because you made the iron monster breathe fire. Hank told him you were just smarter than the rest of us. Clara took a sip, the sweet coffee warming her throat. I'm not a witch, Wyatt. Just a telegrapher who spent too much time in the basement of the Chicago Exchange. Wyatt looked around the stark, freezing attic. You don't have to stay up here, Clara. There are guest rooms on the second floor. Rooms with fireplaces. I locked Martha's door like you asked. You've proven your point. You don't have to freeze to keep your pride intact. Clara looked out the window. I like the view. Wyatt followed her gaze, his expression sobering. He remembered what she had said on her first day. I prefer to see the wolves before they reach the door. Who are you watching for, Clara? He asked quietly. Clara tightened her grip on the mug. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to hand over the heavy, terrifying burden of Harlan Thorne and the ticker tape. But she looked at Wyatt, a man who had just started to look at her with respect. A man with 2 young sons who had already lost too much. If she told him the truth, she would be placing a target squarely on his back. Just the winter, she lied, her voice barely a whisper. Wyatt stared at her profile for a long time. He knew she was lying. But he also knew that trust on the frontier wasn't freely given. It was earned, inch by bloody inch. Good night, Clara, he said softly, turning toward the stairs. Good night, Wyatt. The human body is a remarkable machine capable of pushing through freezing temperatures, starvation, and pure terror until the adrenaline runs out. For Clara, the crash came 3 days after the pump house incident. The brutal transition from the heated telegraph offices of Chicago to the sub-zero reality of a Montana winter, combined with the sheer physical exhaustion of running a ranch household and the paralyzing dread of Pike's presence in town, finally demanded its toll. It started as a dull ache behind her eyes. By noon, her throat felt as though she had swallowed broken glass. She pushed through it, refusing to show weakness. She kneaded bread dough at the kitchen island, the rhythmic motion usually a comfort, but today the kitchen seemed to be spinning slowly on its axis. Sammy was sitting quietly under the kitchen table, methodically lining up wooden blocks. Leo was by the back door, aggressively polishing his father's boots, occasionally shooting Clara sideways glances that were less hostile and more curious since the boiler incident. Clara reached for the flour sack. Her fingers missed the canvas entirely. A wave of dizzying heat washed over her, followed instantly by a bone-deep, shivering chill. The edges of her vision turned a fuzzy, staticky gray. She tried to grip the edge of the butcher block, but her knees simply ceased to function. She didn't hear herself hit the floor, but she felt the jarring impact against her shoulder. Clara? Leo's voice sounded muffled, as if she were underwater. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids were lined with lead. Suddenly, a frantic, rhythmic tapping echoed against the wooden floorboards. Tap, 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 tap. It was Sammy. He had crawled out from under the table and was violently hammering his wooden block against the floor in a desperate, panicked rhythm. Heavy boots pounded down the hallway. The kitchen door flew open, crashing against the wall. Leo, what happened? Wyatt's voice was sharp, cutting through the fog in Clara's brain. I don't know. She was making bread and she just fell. Leo's voice cracked, the tough guy facade shattering into the raw panic of a 9-year-old boy who had already watched one mother die. Large, warm hands slid under Clara's shoulders and knees. She was lifted effortlessly from the cold floor, pressed against a broad, solid chest smelling of leather, pine, and winter wind. Hank, Wyatt bellowed. Ride into town. Get Doc Miller. Tell him if he isn't here in an hour, I'll drag him here by his horse's tail. Clara tried to speak, tried to tell him she just needed a moment to catch her breath, but all that escaped her lips was a dry, rattling cough. Wyatt didn't take her to the freezing attic. He carried her up the main staircase, past the locked double doors of the master suite, and kicked open the door to the largest guest room. He laid her gently on the thick feather mattress. Leo, get Mrs. Gable's old fever blankets from the hall closet, and fetch a basin of cold water from the pump, Wyatt ordered. For the next 48 hours, Clara floated in a terrifying, feverish purgatory. The world blurred into terrifying shapes. She was back in Chicago. She was running through the snow. Pike was behind her, his revolver raised, the jagged scar on his jaw twisting into a smile. She thrashed against the heavy blankets, her skin burning with a raging fever. "No," she mumbled, her head thrashing side to side on the pillow. "No, the wire. Cut the wire." A cool, damp cloth pressed against her forehead. A strong hand caught her flailing wrists, holding them gently but firmly against the mattress. "Shh, Clara, you're safe. You're at the ranch," Wyatt's voice murmured, a steady, grounding rumble in the darkness. He hadn't left her side. He had dismissed the ranch hands, ordered Leo to keep Sammy occupied in the parlor, and taken on the grim, agonizing task of nursing his wife through the crisis. He bathed her face with cold water, forced drops of willow bark tea past her cracked lips, and listened to the terrifying fragments of her delirium. "Telegram 402, Clara sobbed, tears leaking from her closed, fever-bright eyes. "He knows. Thorne knows I took it. He's going to burn it all down. Don't let him find the tape. Pike. He'll kill the boys. Don't let him find the tape." Sitting in the dim light of the bedside oil lamp, Wyatt went completely still. The name hit him like a physical blow to the gut. Harlan Thorne. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Thorne wasn't just a businessman. He was a ruthless, blood-soaked baron who used mercenaries to clear land for the Pacific Railroad. If Thorne wanted a ranch, the owner usually sold, or they ended up buried in a shallow grave. Wyatt looked at Clara's pale, sweat-sheened face. "Thorne knows I took it. Don't let him find the tape." Wyatt stood up slowly. He walked over to the corner of the room where he had unceremoniously dropped Clara's battered carpetbag when she first arrived. He knew he was crossing a line, violating the fierce independence she guarded so closely. But if Harlan Thorne was hunting his wife, Wyatt needed to know what kind of war was coming to his doorstep. He unbuckled the leather straps. Inside, there was pitifully little. 2 spare blouses, a tin of tooth powder, a worn copy of a Charles Dickens novel. And tucked into the very bottom, wrapped carefully in a piece of oilcloth, was a tightly wound spool of yellow paper tape. Wyatt pulled it out. He unrolled the first few inches. It was entirely covered in a series of perforated holes, the physical output of a high-speed stock ticker or a classified telegraph receiver, dots and dashes, Morse code. Wyatt couldn't read the code, but he didn't need to. He understood the gravity of what he was holding. This wasn't petty theft. This was corporate espionage. This was evidence. He looked back at the bed. Clara was a telegraph operator from the city. She had intercepted a message proving Thorne's corruption, stolen the physical evidence, and run for her life into the brutal Montana wilderness. She had sought refuge behind his iron gates, and when he had offered her a cold, calculated marriage of convenience, she had taken it, knowing his name was the only shield heavy enough to protect her. Anger flared in Wyatt's chest, a sharp, violent surge. Not at Clara for lying to him, but at the world for hunting her. He looked at this small, fierce woman who had stood up to him, who had shoveled horse manure into his son's ego, who had bled a high-pressure boiler rather than ask for help. She had been carrying the weight of a firing squad on her shoulders, utterly alone. Wyatt carefully rolled the tape back up, wrapped it in the oilcloth, and placed it back into the satchel. He walked back to the bed, pulled up a wooden chair, and sat down. He took Clara's burning hand in his, engulfing her small fingers in his rough palms. He pressed her knuckles against his mouth. "Thorne isn't getting anywhere near you," Wyatt whispered into the quiet room, making a vow that required no circuit judge to validate. "You're a haze now. Let the bastards come." Clara woke to the smell of burning cedar and the steady rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock. She didn't open her eyes immediately. For a long, disorienting moment, she simply catalogued the sensations of her own body. The crushing, bone-deep ache of the fever had broken, leaving behind a hollow, trembling weakness. She was lying on a mattress so thick and soft she felt as though she were sinking into a cloud, covered by the weight of several heavy down quilts. This was not the freezing, drafty attic. Clara's eyelids fluttered open. The room was bathed in the warm golden glow of a kerosene lamp turned low. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair beside the bed was Wyatt. He was awake, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth, a half-empty glass of amber whiskey resting on his thigh. His chin was covered in a rough, dark scruff that spoke of several days without a razor, and his ice-blue eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. But they were fixed entirely on her. Resting on the quilt, right over Clara's chest, was a small bundle of oilcloth. Clara's breath hitched. Her hand flew up instinctively, her weak fingers clutching the bundle. Through the worn fabric, she felt the unmistakable rigid edges of the paper ticker tape. Panic, sharp and blinding, spiked in her chest. She tried to push herself up to throw the covers off and run, but her arms gave out instantly, sending her collapsing back against the pillows with a pathetic gasp. "You went through my satchel," she whispered, her voice a raw, ruined rasp. Wyatt didn't move. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "You brought a war to my front door, Clara. When my wife starts screaming about mercenaries and cut telegraph wires in the middle of a fever dream, I tend to want to know the shape of the bullet aimed at my head." "Wyatt, you don't understand." "I understand that Harlan Thorne is a butcher who uses the railroad as an excuse to steal land," Wyatt interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He leaned forward, setting the glass on a side table, and rested his elbows on his knees. "I understand that Pike, his favorite dog, is currently drinking my town's whiskey and paying off my sheriff. What I don't understand is what a Chicago telegrapher is doing with a spool of punched paper that has them tearing up the territory looking for her." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. The gig was up. The safety she had desperately bargained for was gone. She waited for the inevitable, for Wyatt to tell her to pack her bag, to order Hank to drive her to the county line and dump her in the snow before Thorne brought hell down on the Hayes ranch. "I'll leave," Clara said, her voice cracking. Tears of pure, exhausted defeat pricked her eyes. "I just need a day to stand up. I won't bring them down on your boys, Wyatt, I swear to you. Stop talking." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of an anvil. Wyatt stood up. He walked to the edge of the bed and sat down on the mattress, causing it to dip under his massive frame. He reached out and gently pried Clara's white-knuckled fingers off the oilcloth bundle. He didn't throw it at her, he didn't yell. He placed the spool on the bedside table and then looked back down at her. "You aren't going anywhere," Wyatt said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You signed a contract to manage my house, and I signed one to protect you. I don't break my word. I don't care if it's the railroad, the Pinkertons, or the U.S. cavalry outside my gates. You are a Hayes. This is your fortress." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, the tears finally spilling hot tracks down her pale cheeks. "They will kill you, Wyatt." "They can try," he said simply. He tapped the spool of paper. "Decode it. Tell me exactly what we are fighting." The shift was profound. We. Not you. We. Over the next hour, fueled by a cup of hot broth Wyatt fetched from the kitchen, Clara unspooled the tape. She translated the dots and dashes into words, writing them down on a piece of ledger paper. It was a direct communication between Thorne and a corrupt federal land surveyor, outlining a plan to falsely declare 3 local ranches, including the Hayes property, as blighted and abandoned, to allow the railroad to seize them under eminent domain. It also authorized Pike to remove the obstacles by any means necessary. Wyatt stared at the translated paper, his jaw locked so tight the muscle twitched visibly. "It's a death warrant for half the valley." "And I'm the only one with the proof," Clara said quietly. "Then we keep the proof safe until we can get it to a federal marshal," Wyatt decided, folding the paper and slipping it into his shirt pocket. He looked at Clara, his expression softening just a fraction. "Rest now, partner. I have the watch." Over the next week, Clara's strength slowly returned. The dynamic in the house had irrevocably shifted. The cold, transactional distance between Wyatt and Clara was gone, replaced by a silent, intense solidarity. They were soldiers in the same trench. This newfound trust bled into the rest of the household. Leo, having witnessed Clara's near collapse, dropped the last of his hostile bravado. He started bringing her firewood without being asked. But it was Sammy who sparked the most profound change. The 4-year-old was still utterly mute, trapped in a prison of his own trauma. One afternoon, while Clara was sitting at the kitchen table shelling winter peas, Sammy crawled out from his usual hiding spot under the table. He stood beside her chair, staring at her hands. Clara paused. She picked up a pea pod and tapped it against the wooden table. Tap, tap, tap. Sammy blinked. Clara smiled gently. She extended her index finger and tapped a deliberate rhythm on the hard pine. Dot, dot, dot. Dash, dash, dash. Dot, dot, dot. SOS. It's a secret language, Sammy, Clara whispered. You don't need to use your voice, you just use your hands. Sammy reached out a tiny, tentative finger. He tapped the table. Tap. That's E, Clara said, her heart swelling. She tapped twice. That's I. Within days, it became a game. Leo, desperate not to be left out of a secret spy code, joined in. The kitchen filled with the rhythmic drumming of fingers against wood. Sammy didn't speak a word. But for the first time in a year, he was communicating. He would tap on Clara's arm when he was hungry. He would tap on Leo's shoulder to play. Wyatt watched this miracle unfold from the periphery, utterly spellbound by the woman who had brought his dead house back to life. Late one evening, the boys were fast asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, save for the howling of the Montana wind, tearing at the eaves. Clara was sitting by the massive stone hearth in the parlor, reading her worn Dickens novel by the firelight. Wyatt walked in, smelling of fresh snow and leather. He tossed his gloves onto a side table and walked over to the fire, holding his hands out to the blaze. He watched Clara in silence for a long time. You taught him how to talk without speaking, Wyatt murmured, his voice low and raspy in the quiet room. Clara closed her book, looking up. He always had a voice, Wyatt. He just needed a safe way to let it out. Wyatt stepped away from the fire. He moved to the leather sofa and sat down right beside her, closer than he had ever sat before. The sheer size of him, the radiant heat of his body made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Show me, Wyatt said. Clara blinked, suddenly hyper-aware of his proximity. Show you. Morse code? Show me how you do it. Wyatt extended his right hand, resting it on the cushion between them, palm up. His hand was massive. The skin was tanned, marked by pale scars from barbed wire and rope burns, the calluses thick and hard. It was a hand built for violence and grueling labor. Clara hesitated. Her own hands were small, pale and trembling slightly. Slowly she reached out. She didn't tap the armrest. She rested her left hand beneath his, supporting his heavy palm, and brought her right index finger to the center of his hand. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt of electricity shot up Clara's arm. Wyatt let out a sharp, barely audible intake of breath, his fingers twitching, curling slightly inward as if wanting to trap her hand against his. A dot is a quick tap, Clara whispered, her voice suddenly husky. She pressed her fingertip lightly into the center of his palm. Tap. Wyatt's eyes darkened, dropping from her face to watch her fingers. A dash is a longer press, like a drag. Clara pressed her finger down and slowly, deliberately dragged it across the sensitive skin of his palm, tracing a line down toward his wrist. Wyatt swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw flexed violently. He didn't pull away. He leaned a fraction closer, his gaze lifting back to her lips. Spell something, he commanded, his voice a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Clara kept her eyes locked on his. The air between them was suddenly too thick to breathe. She brought her finger to his palm again. Dash dot dot dot. B dot dash dot. R dot dash. A dot 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 dash. V dot. E. Her soft fingertip dragged and tapped against his calloused skin, a fiercely intimate caress masquerading as a lesson. With every touch, the invisible tether between them pulled tighter. "What does that mean?" Wyatt asked, his voice rough with restrained need. "It means brave," Clara whispered. Wyatt's hand suddenly closed, his long, rough fingers wrapping around Clara's smaller hand, trapping it against his palm. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of his breath, smell the intoxicating mix of coffee, whiskey, and man. "I'm not brave, Clara," Wyatt murmured, his eyes searching hers, filled with a sudden agonizing vulnerability. "I'm terrified." Before Clara could ask what he was afraid of, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the midnight hour, shattering the heavy silence. Wyatt blinked, the spell breaking. He released her hand instantly, as if he had been burned, and stood up abruptly. "Good night, Clara," he said, turning and walking out of the parlor before she could catch her breath. Clara sat by the dying fire, her hand still tingling, entirely consumed by the slow-burning fire Wyatt Hayes had just ignited in her blood. Spring arrived in Montana, not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent, muddy thaw. The snowpack retreated, turning the ranch yard into a treacherous sea of thick, sucking mud. The ice broke on the river, roaring through the valley, and the air smelled sharply of wet earth, pine needles, and rebirth. For Clara, the changing season mirrored the volatile tension inside the house. Since the night by the fire, Wyatt had been a man at war with himself. He sought her out constantly, asking her opinion on the ranch ledgers, sitting beside her on the porch while the boys played in the mud, his eyes tracking her every movement. Yet whenever the space between them grew too intimate, whenever a touch lingered a second too long, he would physically recoil, his face shuddering like a locked vault. It came to a head in the foaling barn. A fierce late-spring thunderstorm was raging outside, hammering rain against the tin roof. Clara was in the dimly lit barn, gently rubbing down a nervous mare who had just birthed a spindly, wet foal. The air was thick with the scent of sweet hay, animal heat, and ozone. Wyatt stepped into the stall, his oilskin duster dripping water onto the straw. He took off his Stetson, running a hand through his damp, dark hair. He stepped up beside Clara, picking up a clean rag to help dry the shivering foal. They worked in tandem, a silent, seamless partnership. Clara reached for the rag at the same time Wyatt did. Their hands collided. Wyatt didn't pull away this time. He dropped the rag, his large hand capturing hers. He stepped closer, crowding her gently against the wooden partition of the stall. The storm raged outside, but inside, all Clara could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart. Wyatt reached up with his free hand, his knuckles brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch incredibly gentle for a man so rough. He looked down at her, his ice-blue eyes burning with a desperate, starving hunger. He leaned in. Clara tilted her head up, her eyes fluttering shut, leaning into his warmth, anticipating the crash of his lips against hers. He was a breath away. She felt his lips brush hers, a fleeting, agonizing tease of heat. And then he froze. Clara opened her eyes. Wyatt was staring down at her, but he wasn't seeing her. He was looking at the damp straw, inhaling the scent of the barn, the rain, the life and death of the ranch. The hunger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden suffocating panic. He stepped back quickly, dropping her hand. "Wyatt?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with confusion and the sting of sudden rejection. "I can't," Wyatt rasped, turning away from her, gripping the top rail of the stall until the wood groaned. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" Clara's heart plummeted, replaced instantly by a surge of fierce defensive pride. She knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't that he didn't want her. It was that he was terrified of wanting her. "Is it Martha?" Clara asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the ache in her chest. Wyatt flinched as if struck. He didn't look at her. Martha hated this place. The isolation, the winters, the dirt. It slowly drained the life out of her until there was nothing left but a shell. She died because I brought her to a place that kills soft things. He finally turned to face Clara, his expression tortured. You fixed my engine, Clara. You fought off a fever. You took on my sons. But you are a city girl. You have a target on your back. If I let myself... He swallowed hard. If I let you in, and this land or thorn takes you from me, it will kill me. I can't survive burying another woman I love. The admission hung in the humid air of the barn. Another woman I love. It was a confession, but it was wrapped in a coward's armor. Clara did not cry. She squared her shoulders, her chin lifting with the unbreakable resolve that had kept her alive through the blizzard. I am not soft, Wyatt. And I am not Martha, Clara said, her voice ringing clear over the thunder. I didn't break in the snow, and I won't break on this ranch. But I refuse to be punished for the sins of the past, and I absolutely refuse to compete with a ghost. She stepped past him, walking out of the stall. She paused at the barn doors, looking back at the massive, broken man standing in the shadows. I signed a contract to be your partner, Clara said quietly. But I will not be your almost. When you are ready to live in the present, Wyatt. You know where my room is. Until then, keep your distance. Clara walked out into the pouring rain, leaving Wyatt alone with the newborn foal and the crushing weight of his own fear. For 2 agonizing days, they existed in a state of excruciating politeness. They spoke only of the weather and the boys. Clara poured her energy into teaching Leo and Sammy, barricading her heart behind walls of efficiency. On the 3rd night, Wyatt stood alone in the downstairs study. The house was asleep. He held a glass of whiskey he hadn't tasted. He thought about Clara's words. I refuse to be your almost. He realized with a sudden horrifying clarity that his fear of losing her was actively driving her away. He was building a fortress to protect his heart, and he was locking out the only woman who had ever managed to make it beat again. He was letting Harlan Thorne and the ghost of his past dictate his future. Wyatt set the glass down. He didn't walk. He strode with singular purpose. He marched up the grand staircase. He took the heavy brass key from his pocket and unlocked the double doors of the master suite. The room smelled of stale lavender and dead memories. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He pulled the massive cedar trunk from the foot of the bed. He opened the wardrobe and began pulling down the silk dresses, the heavy velvet coats, the pristine riding boots. He didn't fold them with agonizing reverence. He packed them with the firm, decisive respect of a man burying the dead so the living could thrive. He swept the silver hairbrush set off the vanity and placed it in the trunk. He stripped the embroidered quilt from the bed. When the room was stripped bare of Martha's presence, when it was nothing but furniture and empty space, Wyatt slammed the heavy lid of the cedar trunk shut and locked it. He dragged it into the hallway and shoved it into the dark storage closet. He was breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead. But for the first time in 3 years, Wyatt Hayes felt as though he could finally draw a full breath. He turned toward the narrow, uncarpeted stairs leading to the attic. Clara was awake. She was sitting by the gable window in her nightgown, a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the moonlit valley. She heard the heavy, definitive footsteps on the stairs. The door didn't just open. It was pushed wide. Wyatt stood in the doorway. He didn't look hesitant. He looked like a man who had just conquered a mountain and had come to claim the summit. Clara stood up, her pulse skyrocketing. Wyatt? The room is empty, Wyatt said, his chest heaving. The clothes are packed, the trunk is locked. There are no more ghosts in this house, Clara. Only us. Clara's breath hitched. Before she could say a word, Wyatt crossed the small attic in 3 massive strides. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He framed her face in his large, rough hands, his thumbs sweeping across her cheekbones, and he brought his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, claiming, and fierce. Clara gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his flannel shirt, pulling him closer. Wyatt groaned, a deep, guttural sound of pure surrender. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor, molding her soft curves against his hard frame. He kissed her with all the starving, pent-up agony of a man who had been wandering in the dark and had finally found the sun. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, tasting the salt of his sweat and the sharp tang of his desire. The fear, the cold, the contracts, and the railroad, all of it burned away in the overwhelming, explosive heat of the present. When Wyatt finally pulled back to breathe, his forehead rested against hers. They were both panting, clinging to each other in the dim light of the attic. "You are not a ghost," Wyatt whispered fiercely, kissing her jaw, her temple, her lips again. "You are my wife. You are my partner. And God help anyone who tries to take you from me." Clara closed her eyes, burying her face in the crook of his neck, finally, truly safe. But down in the valley, hidden by the shadows of the tree line, Harlan Thorne's men were saddling their horses. The spring thaw had cleared the roads, and the time for waiting was over. For 3 glorious, fragile weeks, the Hayes Ranch was not a fortress, but a home. Clara's things were no longer confined to the freezing attic. Her threadbare coat hung beside Wyatt's heavy canvas duster by the front door. Her worn books rested on the nightstand in the master suite, a room that had been entirely transformed. It no longer smelled of stale lavender and dead memories. It smelled of beeswax, fresh linen, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine soap Wyatt used. The transition from a marriage of convenience to a marriage of undeniable passion had been swift and all-consuming. Wyatt Hayes loved the way he worked his land, with fierce dedication and an intensity that left Clara breathless. There were no more polite distances. He touched her constantly, a hand on the small of her back as she cooked, a brush of his lips against her temple when he came in from the pastures, and long, desperate hours in the dark, where the only language they needed was the heat of their skin. Even the boys seemed to breathe easier. Leo stopped treating every chore like a punishment and started shadowing Wyatt, eager to learn the ropes of the ranch. Sammy was still mute, but his eyes were bright, and he communicated in a rapid, complex series of taps against any wooden surface he could find. Clara had given him a voice, and in return, Sammy had given her his absolute trust. But in the Montana territory, peace was often just a deep breath taken before a plunge into freezing water. It was late May when the weather turned. The air grew thick, heavy, and metallic, pressing down on the valley like a wet wool blanket. The sky bruised a vicious, unnatural shade of purple-black, and the horizon flickered with silent, jagged veins of lightning. It wasn't a standard spring shower. It was a front moving in with malevolent intent. By nightfall, the storm broke. Thunder didn't rumble. It detonated, shaking the heavy timber beams of the ranch house to their stone foundations. Rain hit the tin roof in a deafening, relentless roar, turning the yard into a churning sea of mud within minutes. Clara stood by the bedroom window, her arms crossed over her cotton nightgown, watching the onslaught. Wyatt came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his solid chest. His chin rested on the crown of her head. "The herd is in the high pasture," Wyatt murmured, his voice a low vibration against her spine. "They'll ride out the storm in the tree line. Hank and the boys are buttoned up in the bunkhouse. We're secure." "It feels like the sky is tearing open," Clara whispered, leaning into his warmth. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the jagged peaks of the distant mountains in stark, skeletal white. "It's just noise, Clara," Wyatt said gently, turning her in his arms. He lifted a hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "You're safe here. I promise you." He kissed her, deep and slow, a deliberate distraction from the violence outside. Clara melted against him, letting the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart anchor her. They moved toward the bed, the storm outside fading into a dull roar against the overwhelming intensity of the present. An hour later, they were lying tangled in the sheets, the room pitch black save for the erratic strobes of lightning. Wyatt was asleep, his heavy arm draped protectively across Clara's waist. Clara was drifting, hovering on the edge of exhaustion, when the bedroom door creaked open. A tiny, trembling silhouette stood in the doorway. "Sammy?" Clara whispered, instantly awake. She carefully slipped out from under Wyatt's arm, grabbing her robe from the foot of the bed. Before she could reach the door, another crack of thunder shattered the air. Sammy didn't cry out. He sprinted across the room, his bare feet slapping against the floorboards, and threw himself not at Clara, but at the bed. He scrambled up the mattress and slammed into Wyatt's chest. Wyatt jolted awake instantly, his survival instincts kicking in. His hand flew toward the Colt revolver he kept in the nightstand drawer, stopping only when he realized it was his 4-year-old son practically climbing over his collarbone. "Sammy?" "Hey, buddy, it's just thunder," Wyatt rasped, his voice thick with sleep. He wrapped a massive arm around the boy, trying to soothe him. "It can't hurt you. You're safe." But Sammy wasn't seeking comfort. The boy was rigid, his small chest heaving with silent, terrified pants. He grabbed Wyatt's thick forearm with both of his tiny hands. He didn't bury his face in his father's chest. He turned Wyatt's arm over, exposing the flat plane of his inner wrist, and began to tap frantically with his index finger. Dash dot dot, dot dash, dash dot, dash dash dot, dot, dot dash dot. Wyatt frowned, looking at Clara in the dim light. What is he doing? Is he scared of the lightning? Clara froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her entirely numb. She had spent 1,000 hours in the Chicago Exchange, listening to that exact sequence of rhythms. It was etched into her bones. "He's not spelling thunder, Wyatt," Clara breathed, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "He's spelling Danger." Wyatt's sleep-fogged brain snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. He looked down at Sammy. The boy's eyes were wide, staring in absolute terror toward the bedroom window. Sammy pointed a trembling finger toward the glass. Wyatt threw off the quilt. He didn't turn on the oil lamp. He moved in absolute darkness, stalking toward the window and pressing his back against the wall, peering out through a narrow slit in the heavy drapes. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ranch yard for one brutal, blinding second. It was enough. The main gate chain had been cut. Slipping through the mud and the driving rain were shadows. 12 of them. They wore long canvas dusters, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats, carrying Winchester repeating rifles. They were moving with tactical precision, fanning out to form a perimeter around the main house. 2 of the shadows were creeping toward the bunkhouse, carrying heavy iron chains. In the next flash of lightning, Wyatt saw them wrap the chains around the bunkhouse door handles, securing them with a heavy padlock. They were locking his ranch hands inside. "Thorn," Wyatt hissed, his voice lethal. "They've surrounded the house?" Clara asked, rushing to the closet and pulling out a heavy woolen skirt and her boots. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were completely utilitarian. The telegraph operator was gone, the survivor had taken over. "They're locking Hank and the men in the bunkhouse. We are cut off," Wyatt said. He crossed the room, pulling his trousers and boots on with frantic speed. He racked the slide of his Colt, the mechanical clack-clack sounding obscenely loud in the quiet room. Sammy heard them on the porch roof. "They're trying to take the house quietly." "They won't take it quietly," Clara said, her eyes meeting his in the dark. "Leo," Wyatt said sharply. "Get Leo." Clara ran down the hall. She didn't bother with knocking. She burst into Leo's room. The 9-year-old was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "Clara, what's going on?" "Get your boots on, Leo, right now. Do not turn on the light," Clara commanded. Her voice broker no argument. She grabbed his arm, pulling him out of bed. "We have company." Leo's eyes widened, understanding dawning instantly. He didn't cry. He reached under his bed and pulled out his boots. By the time Clara corralled both boys into the upstairs hallway, Wyatt was emerging from his study carrying 2 Winchester lever-action rifles and a heavy leather bandolier of ammunition. He tossed one of the rifles to Clara. She caught it awkwardly, the heavy wood and steel unfamiliar in her hands. "Do you know how to use it?" Wyatt asked, his eyes burning into hers. "Point and pull," Clara said, her jaw setting. "It kicks like a mule. Brace it against your shoulder." Wyatt knelt down in front of his sons. He grabbed Leo by the shoulders. "Listen to me. You take your brother, and you get into the root cellar under the kitchen floorboards. You lock the heavy iron bolt from the inside, and you do not make a sound. Do you understand me? I don't care what you hear up here. You stay in the dark." Leo's lower lip trembled, but he nodded fiercely. "I can shoot, Pa. I can help. Your job is Sammy. You protect your brother." "That makes you my right hand tonight," Wyatt said, pulling the boy into a hard, brief hug. A sudden deafening crash shattered the tension. The heavy oak front door groaned as something massive, a battering ram or a sledgehammer, slammed into it. The wood splintered, but the deadbolt held. "Go!" Wyatt roared. Clara pushed the boys toward the back stairs leading to the kitchen. As they vanished into the shadows, a second crash hit the front door. Wyatt stepped out onto the top landing of the grand staircase, racking around into the chamber of his Winchester. Clara stood 10 feet away, bracing her rifle against the banister, aiming at the entryway below. The storm raged outside, but inside the Hayes Ranch, the real thunder was about to begin. The front door gave way on the third strike. The heavy oak shattered inward, the deadbolt tearing out a chunk of the door frame. Rain and wind howled into the grand foyer, bringing with it 3 men in soaking wet dusters. They poured through the breach, their rifles raised. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a warning, and he didn't ask for their surrender. This was his home, and they had crossed the threshold with intent to kill. His Winchester roared. The deafening crack echoed off the mahogany walls, followed instantly by the bright, blinding muzzle flash. The lead man jerked violently backward, his chest exploding in a spray of red, and collapsed onto the polished floorboards. The other 2 men dove for cover behind a heavy velvet sofa, returning fire blindly. Bullets chewed into the wooden banister inches from Clara's face, showering her with razor-sharp splinters. She ducked hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Clara, stay down!" Wyatt yelled, working the lever of his rifle with terrifying mechanical precision. He fired twice more, pinning the men down. From the back of the house, the sound of breaking glass shattered the momentary lull. "The kitchen!" Clara shouted over the ringing in her ears. If they got into the kitchen, they would be standing directly over the root cellar, where Leo and Sammy were hiding. Clara didn't wait for Wyatt. She scrambled on her hands and knees down the upstairs hallway, her woolen skirt dragging on the floorboards, until she reached the top of the servants' stairs. She peered down into the darkness. A shadow was climbing through the shattered window above the kitchen sink. Clara raised the heavy Winchester. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely keep the iron sights aligned. She remembered Wyatt's words. "It kicks like a mule. Brace it." She tucked the stock firmly into the pocket of her shoulder, squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, and pulled the trigger. The recoil punched her backward, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her ears rang with a high, sustained whine. When she opened her eyes, the shadow in the window was gone, replaced by a dark smear against the broken glass and a heavy thud in the mud outside. "I got him," Clara gasped, her hands trembling as she fumbled to work the lever, ejecting the smoking brass casing. It clattered against the wooden stairs. Wyatt retreated from the front landing, moving backward down the hall until he was crouched beside her. "There are too many of them, Clara," he panted, his face smeared with sweat and gunpowder. "They have us pinned in the center of the house. They're going to start throwing kerosene lanterns through the windows soon. They'll burn us out." Hank and the men. "Chained in the bunkhouse. I saw Thorne's men covering the doors with rifles. They can't break out without getting slaughtered." Clara leaned her head back against the wall, fighting the rising tide of panic. They were completely isolated. A mile from the main road, surrounded by heavily armed mercenaries in the middle of a torrential storm, there was no cavalry coming, unless she called them. Clara's eyes snapped open. The military wire. Wyatt looked at her, confused. What? When I was in the attic, Clara said, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush, I saw a thick rusted copper line crossing the eastern ridge. It drops low and touches the roof of the high barn before stringing out toward the highway. It's an old military telegraph line from the Indian Wars. It runs straight to the federal marshal outpost in Helena. It's been abandoned for 20 years, Clara. It's dead wire. If the line is intact, it conducts, Clara insisted, gripping his arm. I have my pocket ticker and a spool of copper wire in my satchel. If I can reach that line and splice into it, I can use the battery in my ticker to push a localized signal. I can send an SOS directly to the marshals. Wyatt stared at her, horrified. The wire is on the roof of the high barn. To get there, you have to run 80 yards across the open yard, in the mud, while a dozen men are shooting at the house. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. No, absolutely not. It's suicide. Wyatt, if I don't make that call, we all die tonight, Clara yelled over another volley of gunfire from the foyer. They will burn this house down with your sons in the floorboards. I am the only one who knows how to tap the code. I have to go. Wyatt's jaw locked. He looked at the woman he loved, the pragmatic, fiercely stubborn woman who had dragged him back to the land of the living. He knew she was right, and it was tearing him apart. I'll draw their fire, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, fatalistic rasp. I'll go out the front door. You go out the kitchen. When I start shooting, you run like the devil is on your heels. Do not stop. Do not look back. I won't, Clara promised. She reached up, pulling his face down to hers, and kissed him hard. A kiss of gunpowder and desperate, ferocious love. I'll see you when it's done. Clara grabbed her satchel from the bedroom, slinging it across her chest, and left the rifle. It was too heavy to run with. She crept down the back stairs, her boots silent on the wood, until she reached the kitchen. She paused over the rug that hid the root cellar door. I love you both. Be brave, she whispered to the floorboards. She moved to the back door, gripping the brass handle. She counted to 3. From the front of the house, a massive explosion of gunfire erupted. Wyatt had kicked open the shattered front door, unleashing a relentless barrage of suppressing fire into the yard, screaming a primal, terrifying battle cry to draw every eye toward him. Clara threw open the kitchen door and ran. The rain hit her like a physical wall. The yard was a nightmare of thick, sucking mud. Her boots slipped and slid, threatening to pitch her face forward into the muck. She pumped her arms, her lungs burning, her eyes locked on the towering silhouette of the high barn. Crack! Zing! A bullet whipped past her ear, so close she felt the displaced air. Someone had spotted her. Girl in the yard! A voice roared through the storm. Mud geysered up to her left as a second bullet struck the earth. Clara didn't weave. She just ran faster, driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She reached the heavy wooden doors of the barn, grabbed the iron handle, and threw herself inside, collapsing into the dry hay just as a volley of bullets splintered the wood where she had been standing seconds before. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She scrambled up the wooden ladder leading to the hayloft, her muscles screaming. Above her, a small access hatch led to the pitched tin roof. Clara shoved the hatch open and pulled herself out into the raging storm. The wind up here was vicious, threatening to tear her right off the slippery, rain-slicked tin. She crawled on her hands and knees, sliding backward an inch for every 2 she gained, until she reached the rusted iron weather vane at the peak. There it was, a thick, oxidized copper wire strung just inches above the ridge. Clara pulled her pocket ticker from her satchel. With trembling, freezing fingers, she used a small pocket knife to strip the heavy rubber casing off the military wire. She wrapped the raw copper lead of her ticker around the exposed line, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the circuit would hold. She turned on the small battery pack. A tiny green spark arched between the wires. It was alive. Clara rested her thumb on the brass telegraph key. The rain was blinding her. Her hands were completely numb, but her mind was perfectly clear. Tap-tap. U.S. Marshal Helena. This is Clara Vance. Hayes Ranch Under Siege by Harlan Thorne Mercenaries. Have railroad conspiracy evidence. Send cavalry. SOS, SOS. She tapped the message twice, her thumb flying in a desperate, frantic blur over the key. She tapped it a third time, just to be sure. Suddenly, the access hatch behind her slammed open. Clara spun around, slipping on the wet tin. Emerging from the darkness of the hayloft was a man in a soaked duster. A flash of lightning illuminated his face. It was Pike. The jagged scar on his jaw twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer. He raised a heavy Colt revolver, pointing it directly at Clara's chest. "End of the line, little bird," Pike said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. He thumbed the hammer back with a metallic click. Clara looked at the barrel of the gun. She had sent the message. If she died on this roof, the marshals were still coming. Wyatt and the boys would survive. Harlan Thorne would hang. She didn't cower. She didn't beg. She looked Pike dead in the eye, lifted her chin, and waited for the flash. A deafening roar erupted. But it didn't come from Pike's gun. Pike's eyes went wide. He gasped, a wet, choking sound as a dark stain bloomed rapidly across the chest of his canvas duster. He dropped his revolver, his knees buckling, and he pitched backward, tumbling down the slick tin roof and falling silently into the muddy yard below. Clara stared, paralyzed by shock. Climbing up through the access hatch, rain slicking his dark hair to his forehead, was Leo. The 9-year-old boy was struggling under the weight of a heavy Winchester rifle, the barrel still smoking in the freezing rain. Leo looked at the spot where Pike had been, then looked up at Clara. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the horrifying reality of what he had just done. But his jaw was set with the exact same stubborn, unbreakable steel as his father's. "I told Pa I could shoot," Leo yelled over the storm, his voice cracking. Clara didn't care about the rain or the mud. She slid down the roof, grabbed the boy by his suspenders, and pulled him into a crushing, desperate hug. She buried her face in his wet hair, sobbing a mixture of pure relief and fierce pride. "You did good, Leo," she wept, holding him tight. "You did so good." Down in the valley, a new sound began to cut through the thunder. It wasn't the crack of mercenary rifles. It was the heavy, rhythmic thundering of 50 horses galloping at full speed, and the sharp, piercing blow of a United States cavalry bugle. The marshals had heard the wire. The siege of the Hayes Ranch was over. Dawn broke over the Montana territory, not with a gentle glow, but with the stark, blinding clarity of a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving the Hayes Ranch battered, mud-soaked, and shrouded in the drifting smoke of spent gunpowder. But it was still standing. In the center of the ruined yard, surrounded by 50 heavily armed United States cavalrymen and federal marshals, Harlan Thorne knelt in the mud. The untouchable railroad baron looked like a cornered rat, his expensive wool suit ruined, his hands bound in heavy iron shackles. Beside him, the surviving mercenaries were being disarmed and loaded into transport wagons. Clara stood by the bullet-pocked heavy oak doors of the main house, a heavy blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders. She watched as the lead marshal tucked her oilcloth-wrapped spool of ticker tape into his saddlebag, the ironclad proof that would hang Thorne and dismantle his empire. But Clara's focus wasn't on the lawmen or the defeated baron. Her eyes were fixed on the man striding across the yard toward her. Wyatt's face was smeared with soot and blood from a shallow graze along his cheekbone. His duster was torn, his chest heaving with the adrenaline crash that follows a battle for survival. He didn't slow his pace as he reached the porch. He dropped his Winchester into the mud, took the stairs 2 at a time, and hauled Clara into his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of rain, copper wire, and smoke. He held her so tightly her ribs ached, a desperate, crushing embrace that communicated everything his exhausted voice could not. "I heard the bugle," Wyatt rasped against her skin, his large hands trembling as they stroked her damp hair. "I looked up at the barn roof and I saw you. Clara, I thought I was too late." "You were right on time," Clara whispered, her tears soaking into his collar. We all were. Leo walked out onto the porch, his face pale, but his chin held high. Wyatt released Clara just enough to pull his eldest son into the embrace. The stoic rancher dropped to his knees in the mud, wrapping his arms around the boy who had crossed the threshold from childhood to manhood in the span of a single gunshot. "I got him, Pa," Leo said, his voice cracking, the tears finally falling. "He had a gun on Clara. I couldn't let him." "I know, son. I know," Wyatt choked out, pressing his forehead against Leo's shoulder. "You saved her. You saved all of us. I have never been more proud of you in my entire life." From the doorway, a small, quiet shadow emerged. Sammy walked out in his nightshirt, clutching his carved wooden horse. He didn't tap a warning. He simply walked into the center of his family and wrapped his tiny arms around his father's neck. The wolves were dead. The fortress had held. They had survived the winter. Summer in the valley was a revelation of emerald green and gold. 3 months had passed since the siege. The bullet holes in the grand staircase had been filled and sanded smooth, the shattered front door replaced by a masterpiece of solid, carved mahogany. The Hayes Ranch hummed not with the frantic tension of survival, but with the steady, prosperous rhythm of a family putting down deep roots. The threat of the railroad was a fading memory. Harlan Thorne was awaiting trial in a federal penitentiary back east, denied bail and stripped of his assets. The valley was safe, the land secure. It was late August, the air thick with the scent of sweetgrass and the rhythmic hum of cicadas. Clara sat on the wide wraparound porch, a pitcher of iced lemonade sweating on the table beside her. She wore a light cotton dress, her face tanned by the Montana sun, her bare feet resting on the warm wooden floorboards. She was no longer the freezing, desperate telegrapher who had collapsed at the iron gates. She was the undisputed mistress of the Hayes Ranch, the heart of the home. Down in the lower paddock, Wyatt was teaching Leo how to rope a stubborn calf. The sound of their laughter, loud, unburdened, and genuine, drifted up on the warm breeze. Wyatt handed the rope to one of the hands and ducked through the wooden fence, jogging up the slight incline toward the house. He took off his Stetson, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. When his ice-blue eyes found Clara on the porch, a slow, devastatingly warm smile spread across his face. He walked up the steps, his boots thudding softly, and leaned against the porch railing right in front of her. "You look entirely too comfortable," Wyatt teased, his gaze dragging over her in a way that still made Clara's pulse skip a beat. "I negotiated a very strict contract," Clara shot back, her eyes dancing with mischief. "It included provisions for lemonade on hot afternoons." Wyatt's smile softened into something deeply tender and profoundly serious. He reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest. "About that contract," he said quietly. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. Clara recognized it instantly. It was the marriage document they had signed in the freezing parlor 1 year ago today. The day they had struck a desperate bargain for a roof and a respectable facade. Wyatt didn't open it. He didn't read the terms. He simply struck a match against the porch railing, held the flame to the corner of the heavy paper, and watched it catch. Clara stood up, her breath catching in her throat, as the contract burned, turning into black ash that scattered into the summer wind. "I don't need a business partner anymore," Wyatt said, dropping the last burning fragment onto the dirt and crushing it beneath his boot. He stepped closer to her, his massive frame blocking out the late afternoon sun. "And I don't need a mother for my boys. They already have one." He reached into his pocket a second time. This time he pulled out a small, worn velvet box. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. Wyatt didn't drop to one knee. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was a partnership forged in blood, snow, and steel. He stood toe-to-toe with her, an equal, a man who had been shattered and painstakingly put back together by the woman standing in front of him. He flipped the box open. Inside rested a ring. It wasn't Martha's delicate heirloom, And it wasn't the 75-cent steel band Clara had bought at the blacksmith. It was custom-made, a brilliant, clear diamond set in a band of braided gold and silver, strong and enduring. "Take off your glove, Clara," Wyatt commanded softly. Clara realized she was gripping the porch rail so tightly her knuckles were white. She let go, extending her left hand. She slid the cheap steel band off her finger and placed it on the table. Wyatt took her bare hand in his. His rough, calloused fingers cradled hers with agonizing gentleness. But he didn't put the ring on her finger right away. Instead, he turned her hand over, exposing her soft palm to the warm air. He looked deep into her eyes, holding her gaze with a fierce, unwavering intensity. He extended his right index finger and pressed it to the center of her palm. Dot, dot. "I," Clara gasped, the breath leaving her lungs in a rush. A tear spilled over her lashes, tracking hot down her cheek. Wyatt's finger moved deliberately, tracing the rhythm against her sensitive skin, speaking the language that had saved their lives. Dot, dash, dot, dot. L, dash, dash, dash. O, dot, 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 dash. V, dot. E. He paused, his thumb sweeping across her knuckles, wiping away a teardrop that had fallen onto their joined hands. Dash, dot, dash, dash. Y, dash, dash, dash. O, dot, dot, dash. U. The physical sensation of the words tapped into her skin was more intimate, more shattering than any poem or grand declaration could ever be. It was their secret language, born of trauma and transformed into an unbreakable vow. "I love you, Clara Hayes," Wyatt whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am asking you, free of debt, free of fear, and free of the past. Will you be my wife? For real? For the rest of my life?" "Yes," Clara sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes. For real. Forever." Wyatt caught her waist, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in like she was oxygen. He slipped the braided gold ring onto her finger, sealing the promise. He kissed her, a deep, sun-drenched, sweeping kiss that tasted of lemonade and absolute certainty. A sudden, sharp tug on Clara's skirt broke them apart. They looked down. Sammy was standing there, his wooden horse tucked under his arm. He looked at Wyatt, then looked up at Clara, his big gray eyes wide and serious. He didn't reach out to tap on her arm. He didn't look for a wooden post. Sammy opened his mouth, took a deep breath, and let out a sound that was rusty, quiet, but unmistakably clear. "Mama." Clara dropped to her knees. The world stopped spinning. She pulled the small boy into her chest, burying her face in his shoulder, weeping with a joy so profound it felt like her heart would burst. "Yes, baby, yes, I'm here. Mama's here." Wyatt knelt beside them, wrapping his massive arms around both his wife and his youngest son, shielding them from the world. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Leo skidded to a halt on the porch, a massive grin splitting his dusty face. Seeing his family huddled together, he didn't hesitate. He piled right into the center of the embrace, laughing as Clara pulled him tightly against her side. They stayed there on the porch for a long time, a tangled mess of arms, laughter, and healing tears. Eventually, Wyatt stood, pulling Clara up with him. He kept one arm firmly around her waist, his other hand resting on Leo's shoulder while Sammy clung to Clara's skirt. The four of them turned to look out over the Hayes Ranch. The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet, burnt orange, and gold. The valley was vast, wild, and unforgiving. But as Clara leaned her head against Wyatt's shoulder, feeling the solid weight of his new ring on her finger, and hearing the steady, peaceful breathing of her sons, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just surviving the frontier anymore, she was finally home.